Okay, let's jump into a deep dive on a nation that really is a study in contrasts. We're looking at Argentina,
Hmm.
a country gifted with incredible natural beauty, resources, a vibrant culture, but, its history is punctuated by these really intense political shifts and economic upheaval.
Yeah.
You probably know it as a powerhouse in agriculture, second largest in South America, a place where cultures have blended in fascinating ways, yet its journey, well, it's been anything but smooth.
It's that incredible potential rubbing up against these recurring cycles of crisis that really stands out when you look at the material, doesn't it? It's a history with moments of just extraordinary growth and then some truly, truly difficult periods.
Absolutely. And to guide us through this complex story, we've pulled together a stack of sources, research articles, texts that sort of lay out the narrative.
Right. And our goal here is to go through this material, pull out the most important insights, maybe find those surprising nuggets, and help you connect the dots to understand Argentina's past and, crucially, how it shapes its present. It's about getting a clear picture, reasonably quickly.
Ready to unpack this?
Let's do it, starting right at the beginning, I suppose, with the land itself.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize the sheer scale and variety of Argentina's geography. I mean, it's massive. Second largest in South America, eighth globally, over 3 million square kilometers.
Wow.
It stretches incredibly far north to south, about 2,300 miles, but its width varies wildly, from over 1,100 miles down to just 250 in places.
That scale and shape are just fundamental, aren't they? You think about the Andes forming that long western border with Chile, and then these vast plains sweeping all the way down into Patagonia. Plus, it has this crucial system of rivers and waterways. This geography meant that, connecting the country, moving goods, moving people, became this huge undertaking early on. It basically necessitated things like railroads later.
Yeah, and to give a sense of how big, the sources compare its area to places like France or Texas. It's just immense.
Right.
And this vast, diverse landscape, it wasn't empty when Europeans arrived. The sources tell us people have lived in this territory for well over 12,000 years.
Yeah. And more than that, the material highlights that there weren't just nomadic hunter-gatherer groups wandering around. There were powerful indigenous civilizations in regions stretching from present-day Peru southward.
Okay.
These weren't simple societies. They were organized, they traded, they manufactured goods. Some even had cities, developed systems of writing, sophisticated agriculture. It's interesting, the sources link the development of these megacities and megawater sources, as they put it, to the rise of agriculture, showing this complex relationship with the environment.
That's fascinating.
There's also mention of metalworking, specifically in the Puna region and the Bermejo Basin, so real technological development too.
So you had this mosaic of cultures across different regions, the Gran Chaco, Espinal, the Pampas, the Puna, with distinct ways of life, languages, beliefs. And then came the seismic shift.
The material marks the arrival of the Spanish pretty precisely, January 10th, 1502. And the stated reasons for the conquest, as laid out in the sources, are quite revealing.
What did they say?
Well, an incessant search for material wealth was clearly a primary driver. Alongside that, though, was the stated goal of eradicating indigenous belief systems, what they called idolatry, and the persistent search for westward trade routes.
Right, the classic motivations.
And early instructions to the colonizers also explicitly included the goal of establishing Christian and, well, what they term civilized culture.
And the consequences for the indigenous peoples, as the sources really unflinchingly described them, were, well, devastating.
It's a really stark picture. The material details the drastic impact of European colonization, followed later by conquest from the national armies of the new Argentine state itself. One source notes, rather starkly, that the simple Indian life gave way to magnificent cities and modern transport. But the cost.
The cost is made clear.
The near total extinction of native Argentino tribes. One source estimates their population at not more than 10,000 in the 1400s and states they were basically extinct by the close of the 1880s.
Wow, that's near total cultural and physical annihilation described right there.
It is, and the sources delve into this further, mentioning, rather strangely, the idea of a strategic killing of the 558 million natives, according to one particular text. Now, that number seems, well, frankly, wildly disconnected from other population estimates we see, but is in there.
Okay, an outlier perhaps, but showing the devastating intent.
Exactly. And where indigenous populations did survive, attempts were made to suppress their culture, confine them to reserves, in what the sources call a furious process of cultural destruction. They were relegated to a subaltern position, basically second-class citizens, through genocidal and systemic public policies.
The sources highlight the brutal methods used, too, mentioning different types of genocide applied, particularly down in Patagonia, and the extensive plunder of resources.
Yeah, and the Mapuche people are specifically cited as an example of enduring historical exclusion culturally and economically. Their experience involved huge territorial loss, resource extraction from their lands, marginalization, and the resulting challenges we still see today. Illiteracy, high infant mortality, economic exclusion. It's a really powerful and tragic narrative in the source material about the impact of colonization and nation building on the original inhabitants.
That contrast between the vibrant, complex, indigenous societies that existed for thousands of years and the devastating consequences of conquest described here, it really sets a tone, doesn't it? For understanding some of the later conflicts and social dynamics we'll get into.
Absolutely. It's a foundational element in the nation's history. You can't ignore it.
Okay, so moving from that initial period, let's talk about the colonial era itself and the eventual fight for independence. The territory wasn't initially its own major administrative unit under Spanish rule, was it?
Correct. It was first part of the enormous and, frankly, distant viceroyalty of Peru. But by the 18th century, King Carlos III recognized its growing importance and ordered the creation of a massive new entity in 1776, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata.
And this was huge.
Oh, yeah, encompassing not just modern Argentina, but also Uruguay, Paraguay, and parts of Bolivia and Brazil. Huge territory.
So this new viceroyalty, centered in Buenos Aires, became a major hub of Spanish power in the region. And the Spanish had this particular habit that proved useful for historians later, right?
They were meticulous record keepers. The sources note the Spanish custom of carefully documenting everything the government did, and they brought this practice over. That's why we have such extensive archives today, many from the old viceroyalty funds, later centralized back in Spain at the Archives of the Indies.
Uh-huh.
A historian's dream, in a way.
Yeah. But early Spanish attempts to actually settle were pretty challenging, especially moving inland. Pedro de Mendoza tried Buenos Aires in 1526, but it didn't stick.
Exactly. Expeditions heading into the interior often face fierce resistance from indigenous populations. The sources mention other explorations too, like Jean Robin apparently discovering the Paraná River around 1600. It was a slow, contested process.
So as the viceroyalty matured, Buenos Aires became the center of intense political activity. The sources really point to how political events back in Spain kept having these ripple effects in the colonies, like the whole upheaval involving King Fernando VII. They also single out one viceroy, Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros, describing him in one source with some pretty strong language, an unworthiest of crown servants whose procrastination supposedly caused torment for the people of Buenos Aires.
You can feel the tension building, that growing dissatisfaction fueled by events both internal and external. It all built towards that pivotal moment in 1810.
Which the sources call the First Cry for Freedom, May 25, 1810, in Buenos Aires. An open council, a Cabildo Abierto, was convened.
Right.
And they formed an autonomous government separate from Spain, first the Junta Provisional, then the Junta Grande. The sources mark this event as the real beginning of the Agrupación Argentina, the Argentine grouping, and the clear division between the colonial and independent eras.
And this revolutionary spirit, it spread relatively quickly across the territory. Various provinces joined that first junta, which the sources termed the Primer Gobierno Patrio, the first patriotic government, a real sense of change.
But achieving full independence and, crucially, unity was far from easy. The sources immediately highlight an internal conflict that just erupted.
Yeah, a war between those from Buenos Aires, the Porteños, and the people from the interior provinces, the Interioranos. That division started early and runs deep.
And Spain wasn't just rolling over either.
Not at all. They launched several expeditions trying to regain control. So, despite this internal conflict, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata formally declared independence on July 9, 1816, at the Congress of Tucumán. But even after 1816, this period was just marked by intense internal divisions and wars. There were actually 4 successful royalist expeditions against the newly declared provinces that lasted all the way until 1826.
So even after declaring independence, uniting the provinces under a single government was incredibly difficult. A declaration is one thing, reality is another.
It really was. The civil war between the Unitarians, who wanted a strong centralized government, often led by Buenos Aires, and the Federals, who favored a system where provinces held more power, essentially raged from 1816 right up to 1862.
Yeah.
A long, long struggle.
Wow, nearly half a century.
Yeah. It wasn't until a convention in 1852 that a federal structure with provincial representation was even formally established on paper.
The sources mention various figures and events during this tumultuous period: General Artigas and his independent regional actions, the back and forth of controlling Buenos Aires itself, the rise of the Empire of Brazil next door as a regional power,
Right.
and the significant period under Juan Manuel de Rosas. His dictatorship managed to unify the provinces in 1842, but the sources note this came at the expense of Uruguay and Paraguay. And his excesses eventually led to a Republican government being imposed in Buenos Aires in 1852 after he was ousted.
This long struggle culminates, in some ways, with the Constitution of 1853, which the sources describe maybe hopefully as a dream of a republic. But even that didn't end the internal strife, not by a long shot.
No, subsequent conflicts, like the Battle of Pavon in 1861, ongoing civil wars through the 1850s and 60s, plus Buenos Aires actually separating from the rest of the Confederation for a time. It all just cemented resentments and controversies. The sources specifically point to issues like tax fugitives from Buenos Aires, avoiding federal control. Old habits die hard, maybe.
It really underscores this deep, enduring struggle between centralist ideas, sometimes associated with figures like Urquiza and federalist principles. The sources even include critiques from both sides, highlighting the mutual suspicion. Unitarians saw federal leaders, the caudillos, as incapable of building a modern republic, while federals saw Unitarians as inefficient and even iniquitous or unjust. The path from colony to nation was fundamentally shaped by this persistent, often violent internal division.
So despite that incredibly difficult birth as a nation, the sources then paint this picture of Argentina experiencing a period of really remarkable economic growth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a real turnaround.
It's described as Argentina really taking off, becoming an upper-middle income economy around the turn of the century. Its rate of GDP growth actually placed it among the top 10 globally right up until the early 1930s.
Top 10 globally, that's huge.
Yeah. And at one point, its speed of economic convergence with industrialized countries, even the U.S., was apparently the fastest in the world. That's quite a trajectory, especially after all that conflict.
What were the key factors driving this success, according to the material we looked at?
Well, a few things seem to come together. The country was naturally well endowed with natural resources, as one source puts it, suggesting biology had worked in its favor. With all that fertile land, the pampas especially.
Right, the natural wealth.
The main export businesses were relatively simple and direct: agriculture, cattle, and crucially, there was this massive influx of millions of immigrants, primarily from Western Europe. The sources describe these diasporas as rapidly boosting both the number and the skills of the workforce, basically growing the human capital very quickly.
And this period really solidified Argentina's reputation as a global agricultural supplier, didn't it?
Yes, it became known as one of the world's bread baskets and an agricultural granary. The fertile land, the favorable climate, just ideal for large-scale cattle ranching and processing agricultural products. The sources note significant moments reflecting this growth, like a significant rise in the Buenos Aires wool exchange in 1913. You could see the wealth accumulating.
And that huge wave of immigration didn't just change the economy. It must have profoundly shaped Argentina's cultural identity, too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources paint a really vibrant picture of this. They describe a cultural landscape alive with thriving galas and gatherings that displayed a mix of rites, cultures, and languages. They even talk about Argentines having this almost poetic, innate ability to mingle and transform everything into music.
I like that. There's this fascinating idea presented that Argentines were kind of imitating trends from Europe and Asia, but somehow still retaining their own unique character through it all.
Exactly. The sources describe a population that's a blend of diverse origins, listing groups like Russ, Kraut, Boer, Can, Curl, Indio, Lyre by Antiques, all plasmating as Argentines. It's quite poetic. The outcome is described very colorfully as a genial, baffling mass of men, women, boys, and girls made of symbols, vocables, sonorities, shapes, and shades.
Yeah.
It really captures that sense of a unique, composite identity being forged.
Alongside this cultural fusion came a wave of modernization.
Yeah.
Infrastructure, cities.
This really kicked off from about 1840 to 1910. The sources highlight the golden decade of the 1890s as particularly significant. Driven by immigration, foreign investment, they mention British loans being used for land sales, and the adoption of modern agricultural techniques. A key piece was the massive expansion of the railway network that allowed for large-scale production and transport, generating profits that were then reinvested into new industries by 1910.
And the cities changed.
Yeah, this is also the era when those European-style grand cities like Buenos Aires really began to emerge. Lots of building, lots of ambition.
But even with all this economic prosperity and modernization, the sources indicate that those underlying political and social tensions, they didn't just disappear.
Not at all. Problems with the political system are noted. Issues with voting, for instance, where apparently many had no ballots, and politicians often securing office through negotiation, backroom deals, rather than straightforward elections. There was growing discontent with the ruling elite.
Fueled by what?
Fueled by the state's attempts to centralize power and prioritize economic interests in what was still, in some ways, a poorly developed society outside the booming areas. The old divisions between regions and elites persisted too.
So still prone to conflict.
The sources state that war and rebellion occurred, reflecting that deep-seated hostility between different elite factions, stemming right back to the arguments over the 1852 Constitution and how wealth was distributed. While the state focused on economic growth and market expansion, creating new social classes, a culture of consumerism, the political system, really struggled to keep up, to manage it all fairly.
Interesting. Did the politicians try to adapt?
Well, the sources mention them using public spectacle and media more, trying to connect with society in new ways. So the political landscape was changing, but those fundamental tensions, the ones rooted in the country's formation, they remained.
So the late 19th and early 20th centuries were this period of incredible economic and social transformation, but with that persistent undercurrent of political instability and social inequality. It really sets the stage for the turbulence of the 20th century.
Which opens with another military intervention.
Yeah.
The sources describe a coup in 1943-44 led by nationalist officers, partly reacting to concerns about pro-Axis leanings in the government at the time during World War II.
Okay. The junta that took power banned political parties but faced internal disagreements, it sounds like.
Exactly. And a later civilian government, appointed by the military, also restricted civil rights and banned most political parties, including the Justicialist Party, which is significant because this is the party that gave rise to Peronism. It's noted that a shift in foreign policy occurred during this military period, including declaring war on the Axis powers. The sources suggest this paradoxically contributed to increasing grievances and demands for greater political participation from various labor, social, regional, and nationalist groups who felt they weren't being represented.
So this is the environment that allowed for the rise of Juan Domingo Perón, a pivotal figure.
Hugely pivotal. Perón won the election in 1946. The sources describe his government as nationalist and popular, focused on implantar la justicia social, implementing social justice, primarily through income redistribution, aiming to consolidate a nueva Argentina, a new Argentina.
And how did that go initially?
His initial period, from 46 to 49, is called the most brilliant stage, marked by policies like nationalizing the railways, supporting domestic industries, implementing price controls. Things seem to be working in a way.
But after 1950, the sources indicate things got more difficult for his government. Cracks appeared.
Yes, challenges emerged. An agricultural crisis, strikes, even military sedition. In response, the sources say the state reinforced its economic interventionism, moving towards a more directed economy. They mentioned the Acta de la Independencia Económica as outlining his government's economic goals. However, this period also came with what the sources describe as pretty tense economic and social costs. It wasn't all smooth sailing.
And you really can't discuss Peronism without acknowledging the immense influence of Eva Perón Evita. The sources put significant emphasis on her, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. She's highlighted as perhaps the most prominent first lady in Argentine history. Her background coming from a poor family in rural province, her rise to fame described as one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century.
She wasn't just a figurehead.
No. The sources make it clear she saw her marriage to Perón as a political partnership. She possessed incredible charisma and instinct for understanding people's needs. She's explicitly called a politician with a wide and well-planned field of action in her own right.
What drove her populism, according to the material? What was her connection?
Two main things seem key from the sources. First, her personal experience and her refusal to accept exclusion from power. She actively fought against that. She had this complex conception of the people, feeling a strong connection to the working classes who she believed shared her own cultural background. She identified with them.
And the second thing?
Second, and related, was her husband's political ambition. She took on the task of organizing politically, developing this welfare political strategy designed specifically to counteract the opposition from the upper classes who sought to weaken Pinon's government. The sources emphasize her dramatic life, her journey from poverty to enormous wealth, power, and notoriety, and this almost mythical aura that surrounded her, describing her as a quasi-goddess or Madonna, quite powerful imagery.
Perón's first government ended with another military coup in 1955. And after periods of instability, the military would return to power again in a much more brutal way in 1976.
This marks one of the darkest periods described in the source material. March 1976, the military seized power, promising to end left-wing violence. But what followed was the complete dismantling of the democratic system, systematic political imprisonment for anyone in opposition, and the military operating with just chilling impunity.
This period is widely known as the Dirty War.
Yes, or El Terrorismo de Estado, state terrorism,
Yeah.
lasting from 1976 to 1983. The scale of human rights violations is truly horrific. One source states at least 30,000 people disappeared. Another mentions an Argentine Association of Families appealing for 20,000 missing individuals. The numbers are staggering and debated, but undeniably vast.
And the sources explain the objective was basically to eliminate subversives and terrorists, which became this broad, terrifying category targeting anyone perceived as having left-wing ties.
It was a systematic campaign. The material describes mass kidnappings, people taken from their homes, their workplaces, transportation to secret, clandestine detention centers, and various forms of torture. Physical, psychological, sexual abuse. Before the victims were ultimately disappeared, meaning they were killed and their bodies hidden, denying families even the closure of a burial.
And initially, the military controlled the narrative.
Yes, through media manipulation and support from right-wing groups, they tried to suppress the truth.
But this narrative was bravely challenged.
Crucially, yes. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, marching silently in the main square week after week, played an absolutely vital role in exposing the truth about these crimes to the world. Their persistence was incredible.
Accountability followed.
Eventually, the truth was revealed publicly, but accountability for these atrocities was suppressed for a long time. The sources highlight the profound, lasting trauma for the families and the ongoing challenge of preserving the memory of what happened against the passage of time, against denial. There's even an unusual detail mentioned in the sources about military activities before the coup, noting security forces conducted ground special reenactments of operatic and musical drama.
That's odd.
It is. It's mentioned alongside their more predictable preparations for control, like co-military media campaigns against shantytowns and guerrillas, creating blacklists and vetting institutions, a strange mix of culture and repression noted in one source.
The military government eventually relinquished power in 1983. Why then?
They were weakened and disillusioned, particularly after their defeat in the Malvinas War, the Falklands War against the UK in 1982. That defeat really broke their credibility. Power was returned to a civilian government led by Raúl Alfonsín.
But the problems didn't just vanish.
No, his term faced severe economic difficulties and political fragmentation. Attempts to hold trials for the human rights abuses were met with significant resistance from within the military and became entangled in political conflicts. It was incredibly difficult.
And this instability seemed to just continue.
It did. Carlos Menem became president in 1989. His government is described in the sources as making a vicious pact to spare the previous regime from trial, essentially granting pardons. This, according to the sources, attacked the heart of the human rights issue and, they argue, dissolved democratic institutions in certain ways, undermining accountability.
And then another crisis looms.
Later, Fernando de la Rua's government culminated in that extremely severe economic crisis of 2001, leading to his resignation amidst widespread social unrest. It felt like the country was falling apart again.
These cycles of political instability seem so deeply linked to recurring economic crises throughout Argentina's history. It's a pattern.
The sources really emphasize this pattern. They point to three key events that stand out. The 1930 coup, which ushered in a period of isolationism. The hyperinflation of 1989. I mean, prices rising nearly 5,000% in a year. Imagine that, and the devastating collapse in 2001.
Yeah.
These crises, the sources argue, don't just happen. They expose underlying long-standing problems that have repeatedly thwarted further economic development.
Let's zoom in on that 2001 collapse as described in the material. Because the 1990s, under Menem, actually seems like a period of stability, even boom, after the hyperinflation.
They did, on the surface.
Ah.
The government pegged the Argentine peso to the US dollar at a 1.1 rate, the convertibility plan. It successfully killed hyperinflation and stabilized prices. They liberalized the economy, lifted financial and trade restrictions, attracted foreign investment, privatized state companies. This influx of dollars, after years of chaos, did spark what one source calls a renaissance.
But it wasn't built on a sustainable foundation, it sounds like.
That's what the sources explain. The mechanics of the collapse involved the domestic money supply growing faster than the actual GDP. So even though the peso was officially pegged 1.1 to the dollar, its real value was depreciating. Argentine prices in pesos rose much faster than US dollar prices, making exports uncompetitive.
And external factors played a role.
Yes, Brazil's devaluation in 1999 hit Argentina hard, making Brazilian goods much cheaper. Ultimately, the economic model just couldn't sustain itself. Confidence evaporated, leading to a run on the banks and a full-blown financial crisis.
And the human cost was immense. People lost everything.
Absolutely. The sources describe banks holding peso deposits going bankrupt. Argentina, which had previously been seen as haven of security for savings, became a place with potentially catastrophic outcomes for ordinary people's finances. The material uses the term pesification to describe how the government forcibly converted dollar deposits into pesos at a much lower official rate, effectively wiping out huge amounts of savings and transferring the previous level of misery, as one source puts it, onto large segments of the population. Just devastating.
Yet remarkably, after that incredibly deep crisis, Argentina experienced a significant recovery. How?
It's presented as a fascinating case study in the sources, illustrating how a country can rebuild economically even amidst political chaos. There's this described paradox. An astonishingly successful recovery happened, while at the same time, the country's political institutions disintegrated entirely. Presidents resigning in quick succession, widespread protests.
So what factors allowed for this recovery despite the institutional breakdown? How did that work?
The sources point to a rare confluence of events, but also crucial pre-existing conditions' historical legacies. These include the nation's existing wealth and maturity accumulated before 1980, particularly its investment assets. Also important was the relatively rapid and socially inclusive growth that had actually occurred between 1980 and 1998.
So foundations were laid earlier.
Exactly. This earlier growth, similar perhaps to countries like South Korea and Taiwan in some ways, had fostered industrial diversification, created a widely educated middle class, and led to a burgeoning civil society with high levels of political involvement. This foundation, built over earlier decades, seems to have provided a crucial base for recovery, along with favorable international commodity prices at the time, even when the formal political system collapsed.
So that history brings us more or less up to contemporary Argentina. What's the picture today?
Well, Argentina is a member of the G20 group of major economies, still the second largest country in South America. However, the sources note that it has experienced a major deterioration of its international position in recent decades, particularly since that 2001 bankruptcy. Its relative standing isn't what it perhaps once was.
And the period after 2001 saw a change in political and economic direction from the 90s.
Yes. The sources describe the rise of a new political style, often associated with the Kirchners, and the implementation of policies that moved away from the more liberal free market approach of the 1990s. Things like capital controls, protectionism, a tough renegotiation of defaulted debt.
How did relations with international bodies go?
Relations with international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which had been extremely strained during the crisis, saw a gradual return to normal engagement starting around 2004. Moving Argentina out of what one source rather bluntly calls the group of pariahs among fund member states.
Despite the return to democracy in 1983, the sources highlight that political instability remains a recurring challenge throughout Argentina's history. It kept coming up.
Absolutely. The material points out that Argentina has averaged about 3 governments per decade since independence. That's a lot of turnover. While it currently functions as a functioning democratic institution, it has certainly experienced great political and economic turmoil, even in recent years. The struggle to solidify and fully realize democratic choice is presented as an ongoing theme, a constant work in progress.
On the social front, poverty and inequality are major issues in Argentina today, right?
They are central topics in public discourse, yes. And the sources note a really significant shift here. Historically, Argentina was relatively equal for Latin America. It had a lower Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, than countries like the US, Canada, or France back in the mid-1970s.
That's surprising.
It is. But it has become one of the most unequal nations in the region, with a Gini coefficient now much closer to that of notoriously unequal countries like Brazil or Chile.
That's a really striking change. What do the sources say about why?
It raises important questions, which the sources discuss, about what specific factors led to this sharp increase in inequality. Was it policy choices, global trends, the recurring crises, and how does it compare to trends in the wider region? It's a complex issue. Public concern about the economy remains consistently very high. The sources mention worry about economy is always the most important issue in polls.
And these issues get attention.
Oh, yes. These social and economic issues receive a great deal of attention from academics, government institutions, reflected in the wealth of statistical information available. People are definitely talking about it.
The sources also touch upon the education and health systems briefly.
They describe Argentina's multi-tiered education system, primary, secondary, tertiary universities. In health, the material highlights a key underlying philosophy. Health is viewed primarily as a social product relating to the state, not solely an individual responsibility. So there's a strong emphasis on public health.
And in practice.
There are ongoing efforts towards integral health policies and universal coverage, although the sources do note that there is public discontent and significant challenges in fully realizing these goals in practice. Funding, access, quality, the usual challenges, perhaps amplified by economic volatility.
Environmental concerns have also become more prominent, particularly since the return to democracy.
Environmental awareness certainly grew after 1983. It led to new laws and the inclusion of environmental rights in the Constitution in 1994. However, enforcing these laws has faced challenges, often impacted by political shifts and the complex way authority is divided between the national government and the provinces. It's not always clear who's responsible or has the power to act.
There's a specific mention in the sources about genetically modified soybeans, which became huge in Argentina.
Yes, they discuss the widespread expansion of GM soybeans. While this has undeniably been an economic success story for the country in terms of exports, the sources also raise concerns. Concerns about potential toxicological profiles, the health effects of associated chemicals like glyphosate, and the implications for rural workers exposed to them.
And climate change.
Climate change is also identified as a significant threat, particularly to agriculture, which is still so vital. The sources cite estimates of potential revenue decline due to rising temperatures and the increased risk posed by extreme weather events, droughts, floods, frosts. These can force farmers to seek government assistance or even abandon farming altogether, a real vulnerability.
And historically, the sources note this kind of tension between development and conservation efforts.
That's right. They point out that while many other Latin American countries developed stronger conservation movements earlier on, in Argentina, a strong focus on developmentalism building industry. Exploiting resources often seemed to overshadow environmental concerns, especially during periods of modernization and industrialization. This created, as one source puts it, a rather contradictory and jarring relationship between nature and nation.
Okay, shifting gears a bit from those challenges, the sources also celebrate Argentina's incredibly rich cultural heritage. Music and dance feature prominently.
And you absolutely have to talk about the tango, right? Its origins are described as emerging in the 1880s in the working-class neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, a blend of styles brought by European and African immigrants. It really took off internationally after spreading to Paris around 1910.
And it's described as
This deeply expressive, often sensuous, melancholic dance. Very distinctive.
There's that wonderful, slightly unexpected quote about the tango from Leon Trotsky mentioned in the sources.
It's a surprising observation, isn't it? He apparently noted the women dancing, quote, as if chained to a pillar, but with that indefinable pent-up motion characteristic of the tango and of Buenos Aires in general. It captures something of the intensity, maybe. The sources also mention a significant renaissance of the tango, a revival in the 1980s.
Popular theater also has a long history in Argentina, going way back.
From the mid-1850s, yeah.
Initially imitating Spanish forms like zarzuela, that light opera style, popular genres developed like gaucho melodramas, and there was a strong tradition of puppeteers. Then the influx of Spanish and Italian immigrants really helped expand theater, brought new audiences, new influences. Classical works were often adapted. The sources even describe the evolution of theater architecture over time as the industry grew more established.
Okay, moving to another massive cultural force, sports. seems huge in Argentina. Sport and national identity are just incredibly deeply intertwined in Argentina. The sources explain how certain sports become these powerful national symbols, creating heroes, collective narratives. They suggest it helps the nation process basic collective anxieties, maybe provides a shared focus.
And football, or soccer as some call it, is without question the most central sport. King football.
Its importance is described as just paramount. It's been incredibly effective as a means of national integration, bringing people together across divides. Victories, particularly the World Cup wins in 1978 and 1986, hold immense cultural and historical significance. They're defining moments.
And Maradona?
The figure of Diego Maradona is highlighted, naturally, the hero. One source even suggests his return to the public eye, his willingness to talk, helped somehow bury or process the painful memories of the dictatorship era that coincided with the '78 win. The sources use quite metaphorical language, saying football embodies the hopes, resentments, and tragic aspects of Argentine history. It's more than just a game there.
Clearly. Beyond football, though, other sports have very significant followings, too.
Definitely. Basketball, introduced way back in 1893, with the national team famously winning the FIBA World Championship in 2004, the Golden Generation. Tennis is quite popular, particularly within upper classes, with significant Davis Cup success over the years. Cycling became a mass activity back in the 1930s.
Rugby, too, right? The Pumas.
Rugby, yes. Came over in 1873, really part of the culture now. The Pumas, the national team, have had great success, ranked 8th worldwide according to the source. Hockey is also popular, especially the women's team, known as Las Leones, the Lionesses, who've had notable international success. Auto racing is a major sport, too, with prominent historical races like the 1,000 Miles of Rafaela, and the sources mention that martial arts and combat sports have also gained ground more recently. A really diverse sporting culture.
So pulling back from this deep dive, trying to bring it all together, what's the overall picture that emerges from these sources about Argentina's journey? It feels like a roller coaster.
That's a good word for it. The material consistently points to a history marked by what one source calls perpetual revolution, a sense of unsettled and challenging times. It's a land blessed with immense natural potential and a truly vibrant, adaptable culture, absolutely. But one that has struggled repeatedly with political instability and these wrenching cycles of economic turmoil.
We've seen that thread run through everything.
Yeah, we've traced the devastating impact of colonization, the difficult internally conflicted path to independence, those periods of rapid growth, alongside deep social division, the dark years of authoritarian rule and horrific human rights abuses, and then the return to democracy that continues to grapple with these historical legacies, persistent social inequality, and ongoing economic challenges. It's a heavy history in many ways.
It sounds like that paradox we started with, the potential versus the turmoil, is really at the heart of the story the sources tell.
It absolutely is. A nation with extraordinary resources, a dynamic, resilient culture that has faced these constant struggles for stability. Yet, its current democracy, despite experiencing significant frustrations and turmoil, has shown a degree of stability, especially compared to earlier periods. But the sources emphasize that the struggle for democratic choice, for national progress, is very much an ongoing one. It's not settled.
Understanding this history, even just scratching the surface like we have here, provides such crucial context, doesn't it? For appreciating Argentina's remarkable resilience, but also the depth of its current challenges, and just how deeply the conflicts and decisions of its past are woven into its present reality. You can't understand today without looking back.
Indeed, it's a history defined by passion, potential, and these recurring, often intense struggles. A fascinating, if often difficult story.
So, a final thought to leave you with, drawing on all this. Given Argentina's history of these profound, persistent cycles of immense potential, often giving way to crisis, of moments of unity fracturing into deep division, and periods of intense struggle leading somehow to surprising resilience, what does this pattern tell us, perhaps, about the very nature of nation building itself? And what kind of future path might a country forged from such a complex and passionate past ultimately carve out? Something to think about.